I thought another regular day was coming to an end when I got a phone call that would change the course of the next year. I answered a phone call from my mom, and she told me that my grandpa had collapsed and was in a coma in the hospital. It was crazy to think that everything had been fine, but in the blink of an eye, so much would change. The panic inside me sent a rush of adrenaline through my body. I drove to the hospital and rushed through the emergency doors. I saw a receptionist sitting at a desk, and when I went up to him to ask where my grandpa was, in a very dull tone, he said, he was not helping anyone from what I could see, so I wondered why he could not help me right away. I waited almost 10 minutes while he was on the computer, not even knowing if my grandpa was still alive. Finally, I went up to the receptionist again, and he gave me a look as if I was wasting his time or bothering him. I asked again if I could see my grandpa, and he said, finally, I got in my grandpa's room, and he was in a condition that was so poor they were already prepping him to be transported to UCSF Medical Center. The doctors decided to move him to UCSF because only 10% of his heart was actually working. Because his heart could not pump blood enough by itself, he had to go into surgery to get a pump placed on his heart to pump the blood for him. After this experience, my politic was that there should be more help in the medical field so that in cases like mine, I would have gotten help with seeing my grandpa while paperwork was getting done by another receptionist. A few months later, after my grandpa was out of his coma and the pump was in his heart, he was released into a rehab center so that he could heal and learn how to take care of himself once again. In the first month he was there, he had received a lot of care, and we were given very little communication from the rehab center. So when we got to visit my grandpa, we were full of questions. The nurse that was assigned to take care of my grandpa was very short with us. One of the first things we asked her was about the next steps they would take in my grandpa's healing process. The nurse said, as we continued to ask questions that we assumed she could answer since she was the nurse on duty, she began to get rude as if we should know the answers to our questions. My family and I felt very disconnected, and the unknown about his condition continued to worry us. My politic around this situation is that nurses should be given reports from the doctors about their patients and have to update the family, even if it's through email, so that the family doesn't feel the need to ask numerous questions and nurses don't feel overwhelmed with these questions. About 3 months later, while he was still in rehab, my grandpa had a stroke on the right side of his brain, causing him to be paralyzed. The only movement he had was what the doctors called involuntary movement, which included yawning and eye blinking. Other than that, my grandpa was so severely impacted by the stroke that the brain damage didn't even allow him the motor skills to even process thinking. A phone call later, we rushed to the city to see my grandpa. Panicked and scared, we rushed through the hospital into the critical care unit. My thoughts about the damage that the stroke could have caused scared me. We finally reached my grandpa's room, and the nurse that was standing with him turned around and said, I started to feel angry because this was, of course, my grandpa. I thought I deserved to know what his condition was, or at least why I was being asked to leave in such a rude way. The impatience in the nurse's voice showed little compassion. My grandpa was sick after all. When we were finally let into my grandpa's room, it was only to say our last goodbyes before his pacemaker, defibrillator, and heart pump were slowly turned off. My politic around the rude nurse is that I think all healthcare professionals should have to take courses about communication in dealing with the families of their patients. Following this course, there should be an exam that certifies them to properly care for dealing with patients and their families. I think that this would teach nurses how to deal with communicating to the families that are already under immense stress. I understand that my grandpa getting sick and eventually passing away was in God's hands, but the process would have been a little bit easier had the healthcare professionals shown a little compassion and understanding towards my family.